been a groundswell of folks around the country talking about that we can't go back to normal. Normal wasn't so great. We need to recognize that another world is possible, and we need to make that another world. And that's what this plenary is all about. It's to help us find the signpost to lead us there. We brought together some incredible organizers and thinkers, some of the people that I most admire for their contributions to creating a more equitable food system in agriculture. They're all linked together by their contributions to the book Bite Back. And I'll show you a copy of that book is right here. It's available for sale at the bookshop. And it's people taking on corporate food and winning. So we'll leave it at that. The moderator for the panel is also the co-editor of Bite Back, Saru Jayaraman. Saru co-directed the Restaurant Opportunity Center and is now president of One Fair Wage. ROC and One Fair Wage have been at the forefront of fights to improve the working conditions and pay for restaurant workers, including calling out sexual harassment. They've been instrumental in the battle to eliminate the tip minimum wage for servers and to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, both of which are part of President Biden's, and it really feels good to say that, economic agenda. She also teaches at UC Berkeley, has written 2 books on the restaurant industry. And, you know, I'm not a big fan of having heroes, but Saru is as close as it comes for me. She's the darn best organizer I know. So let's see the plenary.
Great. Well, thank you so much. My name is Saru Jayaraman. I'm the president of One Fair Wage and a professor at UC Berkeley, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by some prolific speakers for today's panel on reimagining the future of food. And we're really excited to be part of the EcoFarm conference, talking about this idea of reimagination of the food system. It's hard given the events of early January 2021 to remember that there is an opportunity to reimagine. We had a setback, insurrection, white supremacists, threats to our democracy. And yet there truly is an opportunity that we just can't forget about to reimagine everything, not only because there's a new president coming in, not only because there's a new Senate leadership coming in, but because the pandemic has forced everybody to rethink everything about our life, about our world, about our economy, about our health, about the way we interact with and treat each other. And as one example, I'm going to speak to what we've seen happen in the restaurant industry, which is the industry I've been organizing in for the last 20 years, and the service sector more broadly. But then I'm really excited to introduce some of our really amazing panelists to talk about other aspects of the food system and the reimagination and potential hope for the future that we're seeing in many different aspects of the food system. From my corner of the food system, we are seeing tremendous potential for change. Before the pandemic, the restaurant industry had a pre-existing condition, as I like to say. We were already the nation's second largest, absolute fastest growing, and absolute lowest paying industry in the United States. Almost 14 million workers, 1 in 10 Americans worked in restaurants prior to the pandemic, but every year we were named as the absolute lowest paying employer. 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs every year were all in the restaurant industry. And that was largely due to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. It largely represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's. We call it the other NRA. And it turned out in doing research that they have been around 150 years since emancipation of slavery, when they first demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything, and have them live entirely on tips. That was a mutation of the concept of tipping. Tipping had originated as an idea of being an extra or bonus on top of the wage, but because of slavery in the United States, tipping became a replacement for wages. And that resulted in a $0 wage for tipped workers at emancipation, which became law as part of the New Deal. Everybody got the right to the minimum wage, except for 3 groups of Black workers: farm workers, domestic workers, and tipped restaurant workers who were told you get a $0 wage as long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage. And we went from zero in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour. And for almost a decade prior to the pandemic, we had been fighting this absurd minimum wage for tipped workers of $2.13, not for a minuscule portion of the economy, but a huge industry, millions and millions of workers, mostly women, 70% women, servers and bartenders, and mostly casual restaurants across America, struggling with the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they had to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families and tips. That was all before the pandemic. With the pandemic, about 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. About 60% were unable to access unemployment insurance because in most states they were told that their sub minimum wage of $2 or $3 was too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. In other words, they were too poor to qualify for the benefits that they so desperately needed. And then, as they were called back to work in the summer and fall of 2020, these millions of workers were finding that they had to do so much more for so much less. They were now being asked to serve as public health marshals, enforcing social distancing and mask rules on the very same customers from whom they had to get tips to make up their base wage. And they were reporting that tips are down. Tips are way down. Tips are down about 50 to 75%. And workers are reporting that they simply cannot enforce these really important rules on the very same customers from whom they have to get tips to survive. Worst of all, about 40% said that sexual harassment went way up during the pandemic, and hundreds of women reported that male customers are now asking them to remove their masks so they can judge their looks and therefore their tips on that basis, making restaurant workers the only essential workers, not only to not receive a minimum wage, but the only essential workers being asked to take off their protective gear for a chance to get their income. It is outrageous. And it is a huge part of our food system, but it's also a huge example for how change can happen. Because during the pandemic, as a result of all the conditions that I just described, we heard from hundreds and hundreds of restaurant owners who said, actually, we think it's time for change. We heard from restaurant owners who had disagreed with us on this issue in the past, now saying we want to join forces to move towards a full minimum wage with tips on top. Either they were moved by the conditions faced by their workers, they were moved by the murder of George Floyd to want to move away from a legacy of slavery, or frankly, so many employers found that they couldn't get their workers to come back to work without paying a full minimum wage. And so we have seen a sea change on this issue in our industry, and the reimagination we have for this industry is akin to the words that Biden put out, building back better, building back a different industry in which workers are actually treated and paid as the professionals that they are, that are provided wages that allow them to survive and thrive and feed their families. And for the first time in my 20 years of organizing, we're seeing a real united effort among independent restaurant owners and workers to fight together for this change. And not surprisingly, Biden-Harris campaign and administration endorsed a full minimum wage, $15 with tips on top for all workers in America, and have named it as a first 100-day priority. It remains to be seen whether it will happen, but the truth is that we've never seen so much momentum for change, and this is part of the reimagination, I would say the reawakening we're seeing in our industry to a new and different future, one in which everybody can thrive and survive. And our hope is perhaps this is possible in many different aspects of the food system, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're really very fortunate to have three incredible speakers. I'm going to just read their bios in the order in which they'll speak, and then we'll hear from each of them speaking for about 12 to 13 minutes, and then we'll ask the group a couple of key questions about reimagining our future and the food system. So first, we're going to hear from Marcia Ishii, a senior scientist and director of the Grassroots Science Program at Pesticide Action Network. Ishii work at PAN includes supporting and strengthening agroecology movements and policies in the US and globally, challenging corporate consolidation, power and influence over agriculture, and international policy advocacy to advance equitable, climate resilient, and ecologically sound food systems within a human rights based framework. She's written extensively on the ecological, social, and political dimensions of food and agriculture and was a lead author of the UN sponsored International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development. Next, we're going to be hearing from Marion Nessel. Marion is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health, Emerita at New York University, in the department she chaired from 1988 to 2003, and from which she retired in September 2017. She's the author of so many award-winning books that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with about food politics, public health, and nutrition. Her most recent book is Let's Ask Marion, What You Need to Know About the Politics of Food, Nutrition, and Health, which came out during the pandemic in 2020. We're so thrilled to have Marion. And lastly, we're going to hear from Jose Oliva, who founded Chicago Interfaith Workers Center and then became the coordinator of Interfaith Worker Justice National Worker Center Network. He served in several leadership positions, working with me at the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, or ROC, the National Organization of Restaurant Workers. He's also the co-founder and co-director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, a national coalition of food worker organizations that collectively represents over 350,000 workers. He's a 2017 James Beard Award recipient and a 2018 American Food Hero awardee. He's now the campaigns director at HEAL, which is Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor Alliance, which is a multi-sector coalition representing over 50 organizations and food and agriculture. Jose was born in Guatemala, and we're going to be hearing a lot about his family story, which is really exciting. So let's start with Marcia. Thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation about reimagining food and reimagining our future.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here and be a part of this panel and this event. Let me just share my screen. That work? So I would first like to acknowledge that I am located on Huichin, the stolen ancestral homeland of the Chochenyo Ohlone people, the first people of this land where I am. I would also like to express my gratitude to the land ancestors and to the many teachers who have shone a light along my path, particularly the incredible women of the Sogorea Land Trust, the visionary folks at Movement Generation, Poor Magazine, and Movement for Black Lives, and the indigenous people, peasant and family farmers, the food system workers whose analysis, stories, and voices constantly guide and challenge me to grow. I'm going to bring us back to look at the global context of our food and farming systems. We enter 2021 with this difficult knowledge. We are facing multiple escalating and converging crises, from climate change, pandemics, and threats to biodiversity, to pollinators, the very functioning of our ecosystems and our waterways, and our own health. The global food system and the many regional and national food systems that are connected to it have proven brittle and extremely vulnerable to disruption from these threats. The extractive, rapacious approach of capitalist industrialized agriculture is a key driver of these multiple crises and has already pushed us past planetary boundaries, that is, the biological and physical limits of Earth systems that are in fact necessary for us to survive, let alone thrive. The disruption of COVID-19 on food production and distribution systems has had further, even greater devastating impacts on communities around the world. Lockdowns have prevented farmers from traveling to markets to sell their produce. Migrant workers have been expelled en masse. Curfews prevent fishers in coastal communities from going out to sea at night. Urban dwellers, meanwhile, have lost access to both domestically produced and imported food. So hunger, especially in this past year, has become such a pervasive reality that people from Africa to Asia now say they fear death by hunger more than by COVID. Meanwhile, repressive governments have also used this pandemic as an excuse to crack down on and intensify political oppression of their people. South Africa mobilized almost its entire police and military to enforce the lockdown, firing rubber bullets at people queuing for food, while Pan Asia Pacific, our sister organization in Malaysia, reported an increase during COVID of the killings, arrests, and harassment of indigenous and peasant peoples seeking access to their land and resources, particularly in Colombia and the Philippines. Meanwhile, the farmers and indigenous people who've been kept off their land, while this has been happening, illegal logging and land grabs have surged. So, faced with so much struggle, what should be our vision and approach going forward? First of all, we need a fundamentally different approach from industrialized agriculture, not just to how we farm, but to how we relate to food, land, water, the earth, and each other. One that is based not on extraction, but on reciprocity, solidarity, and equity, values that are well embodied in the principles of food sovereignty, agroecology, and indigeneity. See, I'm trying to. Agroecology has proven effective in responding to many of today's crises. Akin to farming in harmony with nature, agroecology is productive, adaptive, and resilient in the face of economic and environmental stresses. And because it includes an explicit political and social dimension and asserts community rights over corporate control of the food system, the approach aligns well with the political vision of food sovereignty and of racial and gender justice, meeting the requirements for the food systems transformation that we seek. I'd like to share with you a number of the agroecologically based community-led solutions that have proliferated over the past year and that have relocalized and reinvigorated food systems in response to COVID. In Benin last year, as COVID-19 began to disrupt global trade, agroecological farmers in Pan's network, like Madame Oku here, who had been producing organic cotton, quickly pivoted to producing a diversity of food crops instead. Their already robust agroecosystems enable them to respond flexibly to their community's changing needs and provide healthy organic food at low cost to those most vulnerable. Closer to home in Minnesota, the new Midwest Farmers of Color Collective, with support from PAN, piloted a Grow Connect project. And this collective encourages farmers to share cultivation techniques. They've started a seed library and brought together over 65 community volunteers to work on local farms, following safety protocols, and were able to produce about 6,000 pounds of culturally appropriate foods to deliver to Minnesota communities hit hardest by COVID. These efforts at a local scale can also be scaled up, as demonstrated by the landless workers movement, the MST in Brazil. Over 3 decades of struggle, they've secured land access for 1.5 million workers. And last year, they mobilized their 2,000 farmer associations to deliver 600 tons of food to hospitals and the urban poor. We've also seen enlightened responses that involve governments working creatively with local communities. The town of Maricá in Brazil established a basic income for its people that is part of a solidarity economy they had built around a local municipal currency and a commitment to mutual care and decent jobs for all. And before they had recorded a single case of COVID, the city took a proactive approach to care and more than doubled the basic income that it provides to its lowest income residents, heading off the kinds of disasters that we have seen elsewhere. So many examples like these abound, but sometimes it is hard to know where to start in building solutions from the ground up. I would suggest that we start by centering and following Black and Indigenous leadership in this country. If we are seeking a radically different way of being in relationship to the land, water, and earth, one that is based not on violence, but on reciprocity, we can learn much from the practices of Indigenous peoples and the food sovereignty, seed, and land rematriation work of the Ohlone, the Dine, Haudenosaunee, Sioux, the Cherokee tribes, among so many others. Building relationships based on reciprocity means not just taking, but importantly giving, by actively supporting the land back movement that returns land to the Indigenous people of the area, and by giving Shumi, a voluntary land tax to First Peoples that can be a small first step towards repairing broken relationships. It also means joining Indigenous land and water protectors, like the protectors in Minnesota who are right now putting their bodies on the line and urgently calling on non-Indigenous allies to join their fight to stop construction of the line-free pipeline. Dismantling racism is a prerequisite for building a healthy, vibrant, and equitable food system in this country. We should therefore Also be following the leadership of Black-led movements in this country who are spearheading campaigns to defund the police and abolish the prison industrial complex. We need to be supporting the work of Black farmers and Black-owned cooperatives and Black-led food and farming associations. The Movement for Black Lives has policy platforms in numerous ways for us to all engage in this work, build power, and redirect resources to growing genuine community resilience, well-being, and safety. Finally, I would like to suggest that we develop our muscle in collective organizing that is rooted in relationship. And here I'd like to uplift the concept and practice of bioregional governance. As Angela Aguiar of Movement Generation has explained, a bioregion is a land and water territory defined not by political boundaries, but by the geographical limits of human communities and ecological systems. So by re-engaging with our bioregions, we can naturally start to shift to an ecologically and socially regenerative way of life. Angela asks us to reflect on the natural boundaries of our geographic community, the hills, mountains, rivers, and streams, recognizing that even an urban landscape is situated within a biophysical landscape. So then we should ask ourselves, what is the nature and quality of our relationship to others in our bioregion, to the land we are on, to the people whose land this is, to the most vulnerable in our community, and then investigate, where is there room to deepen, connect, and transform these relationships? We might start by organizing a plant or a seed swap, and then build into a neighborhood practice of sharing food, sharing the seeds we've saved, the herbs we've grown and dried. We can inventory and share tools, childcare, other material resources at the neighborhood and then at bioregional level. Many of us already do this on an ad hoc basis, but can we take it to the next level so that it's not only in response to crises when someone or an entire community falls ill, but becomes the primary way that we live, work, and share our resources. And as we develop this muscle, we can then experiment with creative models of participatory governance, centering and caring for the natural resources flowing through our bioregion. Of course, this work also requires us to challenge structural obstacles to food systems change. That operate at a global level. These include the political and economic agendas of the US and other powerful countries of the global north, the structures of global finance and unregulated trade, the continuing consolidation of transnational corporations so that fewer and fewer corporations hold more and more power and influence over our governments and our lives. A good step to take, as this may seem overwhelming, is simply to join up with the global social movements that have already been organizing to rein in these actors. At this time, for example, PAN is mobilizing a global coalition of hundreds of civil society groups from more than 60 countries to challenge the UN's plans to formalize a partnership with CropLife, the global pesticide industries group. And meanwhile, our comrades in Europe, Asia, and Africa are calling on us here in the US to get ourselves up to speed on global finance so that we can join them in taking on the banks and investors that are literally financing the corporate agenda that is strangling their and our food systems. And so the work goes on. In tying all these ideas together, I'd like to leave you with the concept that Maiwa Montenegro calls an abolitionist agroecology. Drawing on abolition as a practical strategy and a political vision, an abolitionist agroecology extends the political dimension of our food systems work from challenging not only corporate industrial ag, but also the larger forces and institutions of racial capitalism. Abolition history teaches us that transformative change that might seem inconceivable today can unfold tomorrow. Let's remember that the guiding principles of abolition, of agroecology, food sovereignty, and indigeneity are not only about abolishing harm, but are ultimately about co-creating a world of abundance and joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Really excited about the future that you're putting out there. Thank you for sharing. We'll now hear from Marion Nessel talking about the future of the politics of food. Thank you so much, Marion, for being with us.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here on this occasion. And as soon as I take care of all these little technical problems, everybody see that? Can you all see that all right? Can somebody tell me if you can see that?
Not yet.
No.
Oops, then, what did I? As I said, technical problems. Sorry about that.
No
I'm
worries.
looking for, I can't find it. The share screen. There it is. Let's try that. How's that?
There we
How's
go. Now
That's
it's
better. We're now on.
good.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the difficulty. I wanted to show slides just because it's easier for me to do that, and because I like showing pictures and talking about this. I wanted to talk about reimagining our future from the standpoint of where we are now in the coronavirus pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic has done an extraordinary job of exposing failures in the food system in a way I think they've never been exposed before. They've exposed the inequities in our food system, the importance of diet to health, and the inequities in diets and health, the politics of hunger, the way that corporations control our food supply, the way that our government is captured by corporations. And if they're doing any one good thing, it's to set an agenda for advocates. We know what we need to do to fix this system. We just have to get to it. So I'll just say a little bit about each of those things. The coronavirus has hit people with pre-existing diet-related conditions, diabetes, obesity, and others much harder than they've hit other people. And they've hit racial minorities much higher, much of the, at a much greater, they've hit them much harder. A lot of this having to do with basic inequities in our food system and in our health system and in our economic system. Most people, I think, in America really didn't realize how bad this was. A lot of people now do. The great irony of the coronavirus pandemic has been the destruction of vast amounts of food because there were no outlets for it, because restaurants closed. At the same time that people were lining up in cars for hours and hours and hours to get food handouts, something that we haven't seen in America since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I suppose the place where the pandemic has been most visible and its effects on the food system have been most visible is in slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants, where people were already crowded together on top of each other, working under very unsafe conditions. And most of these people were people of color, immigrants, and people at the low end of the wage scale. The government doesn't keep track of what's happening in meatpacking plants, but Leah Douglas, who's a reporter for the Food and Environment Reporting Network, has done a terrific job of tracking this, and she has shown that there have been at least 80,000 cases of COVID-19 among meatpacking, farm, and food processing workers, and more than 350 deaths. And these are just the confirmed cases. There are undoubtedly many, many more. These companies are run by big meat. In fact, the biggest meat we have. The meat industry is extremely consolidated. The top 4 beef companies own 80% of all of the United States capital. This is a vertically integrated industry. This is a huge monopoly. They get to do whatever they want. And the top 4 pork producers run 66%. Very, very powerful industry responsible for a lot of cases and deaths at the moment. We saw the irony of this industry in April when the Washington Post had 2 articles in the same issue. One from workers, one about workers who were complaining that they were required to come to work even though they were sick and not given protective equipment, and another a full-page advertisement from Tyson's talking about how they're being forced to close their doors by mean public health agencies, and that means you aren't going to get any meat. And in response to that kind of advertisement, the president invoked the Defense Production Act, something that he did not do to protect the workers, but instead forced the meat plants to stay open. How did that come about? Well, ProPublica and Public Citizen did a great job of getting public documents and were able to demonstrate without any question that the meatpacking industry drafted the executive order that the president signed, and that the USDA and the meatpacking industry collaborated to fight public health. While this was going on, a clear example of corporate power and government capture by industry. OSHA, the agency that is supposed to protect worker safety, actually fined the companies, and they fined JBS and Conagra a little bit over $13,000 each. And these are companies that make tens of billions of dollars every year. An Iowa beef packing plant was fined less than $1,000. So we have government captured by industry, and that situation continues. This article is from the first week in January, where the Trump administration has approved faster line speeds at chicken processing plants. And we know from data, and the Washington Post has tracked this very closely, that facilities with higher line speeds have more cases of COVID-19. Obviously, people have to work faster. They can't be as careful. 41% of chicken plants with faster line speeds got 41% reported at least one case of COVID-19, whereas in thousands of other plants where the line speeds have not yet been increased, only 4% report at least one case. So we have a situation in which this is a perfect example of corporate control over a very important piece of the food system at the expense of the workers in that system. I want to say just a little bit about the politics of hunger. I've already mentioned the lineup of cars in front of places and food banks that gave out handouts of food. This is entirely understandable. All these millions of people out of work, people aren't getting an income. Unemployment claims are down, but there have continued to be nearly 1 million new requests for unemployment insurance every week since the pandemic started. Andrew Koh, who's a food historian, wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times talking about how these handouts are shameful and undignified. And he points out that instead of strengthening and giving more money to the SNAP program, formerly food stamps, which is the main food assistance program in this country where people get a choice of food, instead the government has opted for a return to Depression-era food lines. And the main method that the government came up with to deal with hunger during the pandemic has been the Farmers to Families Food Box program, for which it allocated $4.5 billion some months ago and has just added another $1.5 billion. The idea of this program was that they would collect food from farmers who had no outlet for their product, which suggested that these would be small or mid-sized farmers, and then distribute it to food banks ill-prepared to handle that kind of volume, who would then distribute it to the poor. Much has been observed about these food boxes. Black farmers say they were dropped from the program. Small farmers that I know say they were dropped from the program. The food box initiative has been demonstrated to cost too much and not deliver very much. And the real people who are profiting off of the food box program are the distributors who pick it up in one place and take it to another. Federal funding, according to reports, has been a lifeline for big food, with all of the money from this program directed to large corporations. And it's been hard to find out what's in those boxes. Some of the boxes look okay, but here's at least one report of food that was given out to families during Thanksgiving that was canned vegetables and anything but fresh food. So the program in many ways has failed to do what it promised to do, and yet it seems to be what the government was willing to do. It ran out of money, leaving families hungry and food charities without the ability to feed the hungry families. It's charity, it's not going to work. We need a basic income in this country. And the Department of Agriculture has just announced in the first week in January that it's going to continue this and put another $1.5 billion into this program. The result of all of this are reports that people are shoplifting food. This is something out of Les Miserables, something that we just really haven't seen in this country since the Depression, and something that really needs to change. If the pandemic has done any good at all, it has been to reveal these things to very, very large number of Americans who were unaware of such things before this. And we know very well what needs to be done if we're going to fix the food system. As Francis Moore-Lampay says, we need to fix our democracy. And that means getting involved in politics in a really serious way, joining organizations, pressuring Congress, doing everything we can to use the political system to get a food system that is healthier for people and for the planet. And I will stop here saying that I'm always saying that people should vote with your vote and make food choices that will make for a better food system. But even better, we need to be voting with our votes. And by that, I mean getting involved in politics. So go out and get busy.
Thank you so much, Marion. It's such a clear example of how these different issues are so interrelated. People don't need food boxes. They need a $15 minimum wage so they can actually pay for their own. So as Vilsack, the new Secretary of Agriculture, thinks about a new food program, let's work together to make sure the Raise the Wage Act passes in Congress to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and eliminates the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers as well. So couldn't agree with you more. It's all so related. Thank you so much. Great. Well, let's hear now from Jose Oliva, who can talk to us more about all the great work he's doing.
Thank you, Saru, and thank you so much to all the other speakers. It's really an honor to be on the panel with all of you. Like Saru said, my name is Jose Oliva. I'm the campaigns director for the HEAL Food Alliance. And the HEAL Food Alliance, I'm also the former co-director and co-founder of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. And the Food Chain Workers Alliance was one of the 4 anchor organizations that helped launch HEAL. HEAL is now a national coalition of 55 food worker, food justice, health, environment, consumer organizations in the US. And I want to talk more about my own personal story, less about the issues. I'm going to try not to mansplain the issues to everyone, and instead just focus in on my story. But what I do want to say about my story is that it is a story of how racism, imperialism, and food policy are all interconnected. And I think especially today, oops, sorry, I jumped the gun there. Especially today after the events of January 6th, 2021, I do believe that my experience can serve as a focal point for analysis and praxis, and maybe for a path forward in this brave new world of ours. It is not a unique story. It's really the story of millions of economic or food refugees from Latin America. And I want to start with a young economist from Guatemala. He's caught up in the idealism of his era. That's my grandfather. He joined students and workers and women and civil society to establish the first democracy in Guatemala in 1944. A few years later, in 1950, he becomes the agriculture vice minister. In that role, his job had been to map all of the arable land in the country. And what he discovered was that over 2/3 of the land suitable for growing food in Guatemala was owned by the US-based United Fruit Company, what we know today as Chiquita. So after 10 short years of democracy, in 1954, a coup sponsored by the CIA overthrows the fledgling republic. Now the coup happened at the bequest of the United Fruit Company, triggered because the Jacobo Arbenz regime administration, the agrarian program that they were trying to administer was essentially to redistribute the land that Chiquita owned, and that land that they claimed at a face value was being paid for by the Arbenz government. Now, there's a couple of key players here. Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA at the time, and his brother was John Foster Dulles, and he was the CEO of the United Fruit Company, aka Chiquita. The program that my grandfather was administering was not radical. It, again, called for paying the company the full market rate for half of the land that they held in Guatemala in order to provide that land to small landless peasants. The coup happened. This is a mural that's in Mexico City that depicts the coup. And my grandfather, disillusioned and angry, moved his entire family to Xelajú, which is where my mother and then I were born. My mother was taught about the aborted agrarian reform and the frustrated dream of democracy early on. She went on to become a teacher. She taught in this small village on the outskirts of Xela. The coup, meanwhile, triggered this 36-year civil war. In the context of the Cold War, anyone who opposes the regime is automatically branded a communist. So over 200,000 people are killed, over 1 million are displaced as refugees, my family amongst them. And given the US's role in the conflict, there was no refugee or asylum process available for people fleeing the conflict. Not until the American Baptist Church sued the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 1992 for discrimination on the basis of national origin could a Guatemalan or a Salvadoran apply even for political asylum in this country. We came to the US after my mother, who, as I said, was a school teacher. She attempted to organize the parents from that school to demand just basic stuff, running water, electricity in the schoolhouse that she taught in. However, once we came to the US, with no refugee status or any other legal status, my mom actually ended up working in the restaurant industry. We were undocumented for almost 20 years. And after being a teacher back in Guatemala her entire life, you can imagine the hardship of having to work really long hours and really hard work. She worked for less than minimum wage. As Saru said, people are paid less than half of the minimum wage. $2.13 is still, to this day, the legal minimum wage for tipped workers in the restaurant industry. I wanted to go to school. I graduated high school and wanted to go to college, but I realized that as an undocumented immigrant, I couldn't access any scholarships or grants. So I started working in the restaurant industry in order to go to school, in order to pay for my credit hours as I went along. After finally graduating college, it took me almost 6 years to get a bachelor's degree. I started to volunteer at a local community group here in Chicago called Casa Guatemala. And one day, a woman came in crying, saying that her husband had been kidnapped. I assumed she was talking about something in Guatemala, and then realized that it happened here in Chicago. And as I started to investigate the claim, I realized that there was this whole underground economy So that, along with my own personal experience in the restaurant industry, led me to create a center to help organize restaurant workers and other informal workers. The restaurant industry, I call it the original gig economy. Well, some workers from a restaurant called us to complain about a horrible boss that they had. It was a fine dining restaurant. And we immediately sprang to action. We brought a local pastor, we brought media. These are some of the photos of that action. We brought community members, and it was an impromptu march on the boss. As soon as he saw us, he immediately kicked us out. So we started to just march in front of the restaurant. And as customers tried to go in, we would hand them a flyer and we would tell them what happened. We turned away a ton of potential customers. So within minutes, as he's watching this, he's outside talking to us. And in the process of negotiating some kind of agreement with him, it dawned on me, or at least what I thought, that we had invented a whole new model for organizing restaurant workers. And then I met Saru, and she told, she had been doing this, or so Rock had been doing this for a couple of years already at this point. And she explained to me how, there was a whole process for actually organizing workers in the restaurants. And instead of reinventing the wheel, we decided to just join Rock, right? And help Rock become a national network instead of the local New York-based organization. Once at Rock, we started to realize that there was this whole new breed of food consumer out there. Our members consistently reported that customers would ask about the food in ways that we had never seen before. Things like, where was this chicken raised, right? Or is this organic produce, and so forth. That trend did not slow down, right? In the subsequent years, other food worker organizations like Kata or brand workers or so forth also started to report similar trends in their sectors. So finally, in 2008, we decided, together with Kata, brand workers, and many of these other food worker organizations, to launch an alliance of food workers with sort of a dual purpose of both inserting workers into the ongoing discourse around food, and to explore what a multi-sector campaign to improve the entire food system overall would look like. So with that mandate, we began to convene organizations that focused on food from the perspectives of health, what food does to the human body, from the perspective of environment, right, both production and waste, from the perspective of access to good food, both rural and urban. And that's how we landed on HEAL, right? The Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor Food Alliance. Food Chain Workers Alliance was one of the 4 anchor organizations. The Union of Concerned Scientists was another. Real Food Generation was a third, and the National Black Food and Justice Alliance was the 4th. The HEAL platform, which took us almost 2 years to develop, we talked to over 150 organizations all over the US to develop it. And this is what we came up with. We came up with 10 planks placed in 3 categories. You can just go to healfoodalliance.org and look at the platform there. But it is literally the work of all of the folks who are on this panel for sure, and then maybe most of the people who are watching this. HEAL members are farmers, fishers, they're farm workers, food workers, they're consumers, they're food access, animal welfare, environmental advocates. They are of many generations. They are of every race and every background. It's baked into the composition that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other frontline folks who are feeling the entire brunt of the problems in this food system are the ones that are leading our work. We have a pretty straightforward theory of change, where we understand what we need to do in order to change the food system. We know that it isn't easy, and we know that it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And we know that it's going to take all of us, right? It is not going to be something that just one organization can do, or that just a few folks, few leaders, grass tops leaders can do on their own, right? It's going to take all of us. And we do think we can do it, right? And the key thing in order to do it is this old African proverb, right? That nothing about us without us is for us. And that really does mean that the people who are most directly impacted, most directly affected by the violence of this food system are the ones that really have the power and the answers to transform it. Our work is really 5 things, right? We are connecting and uniting groups. That's pretty self-evident. We're doing political education through a program that's called the School of Political Leadership. We are advancing a shared narrative, right? We're through bringing all the groups together. We're developing a way of talking about the food system that allows us to be at the center of how that narrative unfolds. And we're connecting and nurturing existing and emerging campaigns, right? A lot of the campaign work that we're doing isn't something that we are inventing, or that that I sit by myself somewhere and strategize what the campaign is going to be. It's really about what's happening at the local level, and how do we develop translocal networks and other strategies that builds that work up. And then obviously organizing funders is critical in all of this, making sure that folks who have the money to resource the work understand how and why we're doing the work that we're doing. I like to think of our work in terms of the micro, the meso, and the macro, right? So at the micro level, we are helping to educate individual leaders. And when I say educate, I'm talking about it from the Freirean perspective of educating each other. Not that we have knowledge that they don't have, but rather that we are exchanging our experiences with them. But that through that process that we are able to then plug those folks into campaigns that are really about transforming institutions, and that those institutions have real impacts once they are transformed on people's lives. And that finally, all of that builds up to a movement where we are able to actually do good at the entire societal level. I want to briefly mention one of our campaigns, which is the Good Food Communities campaign. It includes good food purchasing policies in public institutions and private institutions and other places. It has 5 value categories: nutrition, environmental sustainability, valued workforce, local economies, and animal welfare. None of those categories are interchangeable or exchangeable. We don't value one more than another. So when an institution signs up for the good food purchasing policy, we make sure that all 5 of these value categories are being carried out by that institution. We don't think that any institution can change completely what the food system in that region looks like by itself. So we do want to have as many institutions in any given city or state sign on to the good food purchasing policy. And we do that by building local coalitions, multi-sector coalitions that actually are led by the community in that particular city or state. And that those coalitions are the ones that demand that these policies be implemented at the local school district, the local university, the local hospital, whatever. That is basic gist of our overall impact through this particular program. This is just a list of the cities where we have passed the GFPP. The latest one just happened about a week ago in Gainesville, Florida. It's our first victory of this year. So I'm happy to share it with you all on this panel early on. I will leave it at that, and of course, I'm more than happy to answer any questions for folks. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. There's a lot of work to build on in all these different areas to envision a new future. And what we wanted to talk about now in about 15 or 20 minutes we have left is to really think about, okay, we're building on all this incredible work and knowledge and information and experience to reimagine what is possible in food generally and in each of our areas of work in 2021 and beyond, post-pandemic. So one of the first questions I want to ask is about kind of how we push for a reimagined future. What is our strategy? Because we were in a similar moment in some ways to this 10 years ago when Obama ran on a platform of hope and change and came into office in his first term with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. And there was a real thought that a lot could get done because Obama was in office and was all about hope and change. And there was maybe a cooperative Senate and House to work with him on that change. But a lot of folks didn't mobilize because the assumption was that, you know, he got it. We got our hope and change president, so we don't have to do anything. Nobody mobilized. There was no push from the left to really change anything. And so a lot of people feel like that's why not much got done in those first 2 years of the Obama administration. And so here we find ourselves again with a president who has not run on a hope and change platform. There has been this language of build back better, but there's also been a lot of language about bipartisanship and healing the country and, you know, bringing people together, which could mean a lot of different things. And certainly I think there's a push to make it mean let's be as moderate and milquetoast as possible so that we please everybody, or think we're pleasing everybody. And so, you know, we don't have a progressive, I would say, in the White House. We have somebody who's not run on hope and change, who's run on moderation and unity. And so if we want to think about reimagination of any kind of food politics, of slaughterhouses, of pesticides, of food workers, of how we interact with corporations, of how we think about race in the food system, how do we do it? Do we push from the outside? Do we mobilize? Do we try to work from within with moderates like Biden and Vilsack? Or do we do both, and on what issues? So I'd love to hear kind of what you all think are the key strategies we should be looking at in 2021. And I have my opinions too, but I'd love to first hear you guys weigh in on that. Marion, you're on mute. Do you mind coming off of mute?
I'm trying to figure out how to undo it. You know, I was very impressed that Michael Pollan, for example, was writing, you know, during the Obama administration and talking about how the food movement had no real power, and that, you know, there was a lot of talk. There are millions of people involved in food movement issues. There are thousands, literally thousands of organizations in the United States that are devoted to advocacy around food movement issues, but they're not united. They're not brought together. I'm getting an echo. I don't know. Yeah, maybe let's try that. They're not brought together in a way that has any real political power. And, you know, I've talked a lot about coalition building and the difficulty of coalition building across organizations aimed at different kinds of issues, even organizations that are working on issues that, as you pointed out, Saru, are completely complementary and reinforce each other. That issues about race, women, inequalities, all of these things are totally united. And the big challenge, it seems to me, is to figure out a way to bring these together into some kind of unified group working on picking on specific issues and pushing as hard as we possibly can on those issues, because if we don't do that, nothing is going to happen.
So Jose, that's kind of what HEAL is about. Are you guys thinking about mass mobilization in 2021? How are you thinking to push a unified agenda?
Yeah, no, I think Marion is absolutely right. I think there's got to be a reckoning amongst everyone who's doing work in the food system, that we're not competing with each other, that we're actually working towards the same goals. And I think, just to add a little bit to what Marion said, is we're sort of used to functioning in this nonprofit industrial complex, right? And for people who don't know that term, it really means that there are organizations, nonprofit organizations, that request funding from major foundations, funders, and that those funders and those organizations form sort of a symbiotic circle. They know each other and they fund each other and they work off of each other. And we really have to undo that comfort that we've built over the last 50 years in this space, because that's not where the answers are. The answers are in the community, right? The people, the workers themselves are the ones that are going to lead the way. And if we don't heed that, if what we're doing is expecting to find the answers from the people who've been saying the same thing, that's just not gonna. We're not gonna get anywhere that way. So anyway, so it's critical to me to understand the social dynamics. The U.S. is unique in some ways, but in many other ways, it's just like any other country, right? And if you look at how major transformations have happened in most of the rest of the world, they have not happened with the leadership of nonprofit organizations.
Marcia, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. For Pesticide Action Network, everything we have always done has been in coalition. And in fact, our origination, our founding took place in Malaysia over 30 years ago as a collective, a mass movement of organizations that came together to recognize, back in the 80s, that the forces we are facing, these global forces of pesticide corporations and political elites, are organized globally, and we need to organize globally. And so that was actually that Action Network. Everything we do is in coalition, and in fact, we're thrilled and to be a part of HEAL. Actually, since its founding as well, we very much believe in the work that HEAL is doing, and think that as much as we expand and work across sectors, that's really what we need to be doing right now. I think it is a situation at the federal government level is in some ways it's the same, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, not the most recent one, but before. But in other ways, I think there's some real differences now. We've seen the squad, some real progressive, strong voices in Congress, led by like AOC and Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. And that squad, the progressive plank or movement is growing in Congress, with Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush now adding. And I think that has come from grassroots organizing and from people getting, electing those who are really representing the concerns of workers, of working class families, of the houseless folks, of family farmers and farm workers. So we have that. We also need to be pushing these moderates to get with the program for real change. I think we have the People's Green New Deal. We need to be pushing for that. That was kind of poo-pooed, so, by the establishment for sure, but that is where a lot of very strong elements of a comprehensive, coherent policy framework exists. And we have, I think, a growing movement to really demand this sort of systemic change. And at the same time, we need to really prevent more harm, the kind of harm that all of you have been talking about on the panel. We've certainly seen this with the evisceration of the EPA in this past administration. So we need to rebuild the EPA, bring back science, and redouble protections from from toxic chemical pesticides, threats to our Clean Air and Water Acts. We need to overhaul the USDA, which has long been a more than willing partner to corporate agribusiness. And it looks to be headed in the same direction, but we need to build, and I think we have a more mobilized and widespread movement now to ramp up demand, to put public interest, farmers' livelihoods, farm workers' safety ahead of Bayer and Monsanto and Cargill and Smithfield and all of those bad actors. And we need to put pressure on the Justice Department to have a justice-oriented Justice Department to break up the corporate monopolies and enforce antitrust rules and hold corporations accountable for the violations of human rights we've been talking about this morning, and that we're seeing not only in the U.S. but impacting workers and farmers in where these corporations operate around the world. So both and would be my answer. But I think we are in a better position to keep building on the momentum that we have today, and really demand real meaningful change.
Yeah, for sure. I just would add to that by saying that I've been in conversations with many organizations in coalitions across the country that were gearing up to really try to push on the Biden administration for a reimagined future, not do what we did during the Obama years and sit back and just say, okay, our friends are in office, we're not going to do anything, but rather know that without pushing our friends, they don't have the wind that they need behind their sails to push the change and the policies we need to see. So we had been gearing up for that. This white supremacist insurrection of the Capitol that happened early, right out the gate with the new year, I think so it has moved the conversation somewhat to the right, because now there's a thought among Democrats that they're heroes for simply impeaching white supremacists, that they're heroes simply for holding white supremacists accountable for trying to take over our Capitol. When what we need is for Democrats not just to hold white supremacists accountable for trying to throw a coup, but deliver for the people of color that got them into office in the first place. Let's be real. The Senate would not have flipped without the Stacey Abrams and the amazing folks in Georgia really turning people out to flip the Senate with those last two races. So I'm hopeful that we can remember that rather than allowing the Democratic Party to think that because of the insurrection, they should now stick to the middle because somehow there's a pull to the right. We should remind them that, frankly, milquetoast and moderation is what lost us the party and the White House to Trump in 2016, because we didn't deliver for people, and inequality grew, and hunger grew, and suffering grew, and that leads to fascism. That leads to the election of people like Donald Trump. And so if we want to continue to see positive change, if we don't want white supremacists to take over the Capitol, we actually have to deliver for people. And I just want to tell a 30-second story to exemplify this. We were in December protesting for $15 minimum wage for restaurant workers in Albany, in the New York State Capitol, on the same day that the New York State electors were certifying the election of Joe Biden as the nominee for the state of New York. And so on that day, the Trump supporters, the MAGA folks, the white supremacists showed up at the Capitol to try to disrupt the electors doing their thing in the New York State Capitol. And we were there fighting for $15 for tipped workers. And believe it or not, when the Trump folks finished their rally, they came over and joined our rally, calling for a higher minimum wage. They said, we agree with you. Everybody needs to be paid more. We need more. And it goes, Marion, to some of the things you're talking about in terms of hunger and food. Ultimately, I think, again, moderation and not delivering for people is what leads. I'm not saying that we unite with white supremacists, but I am saying that generally delivering for people is how we actually continue to advance a different kind of society in which people can actually unite across seemingly insurmountable barriers. So That doesn't mean milquetoast. It doesn't mean moderation. It actually, it doesn't even have to be called bold or progressive, because frankly, livable wages and healthcare and food for all are not bold or progressive ideas. They are simply what people need to survive and thrive, and for us not to end up with another Donald Trump. So I would say we need to push on our friends in every way we can, and that includes, in my opinion, as an organizer, direct action. All of us joining forces and engaging in protest, and showing that there is a huge amount of groundswell and support for reimagination. So speaking of reimagination, I'm running up against this right now, but DC has always been so focused on pragmatic politics. If you get mired into beltway thinking, they'll start talking to you about what's possible rather than what we really need. And so this has meant to be a conversation about reimagination. I'm wondering how you all think we can, post-pandemic, with the pandemic behind us and learning everything hopefully we learned from the pandemic, how do we push past pragmatic politics to actually reimagine systems, reimagine the USDA, reimagine food systems to a new kind of politics? Does it require, like you said, Marion, really tying together these issues narratively, food and race and health and gender? What will it take to push to reimagine rather than just falling back into what's practically possible in DC?
Well, I think it's just going to take masses of people demanding it. And some of those demands are going to be unattractive in political terms. That doesn't matter. It has to be done. We've seen what the far right can do with a lot of pressure. We need the I would say moderate left needs to do exactly the same thing. And your choice of Department of Agriculture is a good one, because that's where most of the food policies come from. And we know we have a centrist who is about to be appointed as Secretary of Agriculture. Tom Vilsack is somebody who comes in with a track record of working in the Obama administration to try to make peace across large swaths of the American political spectrum. He needs to be pushed. He needs to be pushed hard to reverse what the Trump administration did in that agency, and to make that agency an agency that is interested in food for people, not necessarily food for profit. This is an agency who's historically been arranged to promote big agriculture, corporate agriculture, with little tiny speckles of things and increasing power over the kind of alternative agriculture that many of us think we need. There's only one way to get it, and that's to scream bloody murder.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I would add that there's also a need to demonstrate what we're talking about, right? So it is great to show how these giant corporations are destroying our environment, literally killing workers right now due to COVID and so forth. That's important because we draw a very hard line about what they're doing and how bad that is. But it's also important to show what we want, right? And I think I'm not talking about just one sort of sample farm that's doing everything right, which is great. That's good too. But I'm saying systems, right? A system is not just one farm. A system is from the seed all the way to the waste, right? That entire process. And so there are systems. There's the beginning of some really model systems. For instance, in Cincinnati, there's a cooperative that is union owned. So the union, the UFCW, owns the cooperative. It's a farm. It's also a distribution center and a grocery store. And because there's good food purchasing policy in Cincinnati, the public schools that are sourcing the food from that farm are actually also doing a lot of great stuff with the waste. And so this literally is a model. It's an example of how this can happen in other cities, in other states, and through the entire country. Right now, that doesn't get us to the question you're asking, Saru, which is, that's a really hard question, right? Like, how do we frame things, or how do we approach the powers that be in Washington, D.C., so that they come out of the stupor that they're in of just doing what is possible, and begin to see what we need rather than the possible. And so I do think that there are some legislative inspirations in the Green New Deal and in other places that actually point the way, right? That show us that this is scalable, that we can actually have jobs at the millions level, right? Not just at the thousands or hundreds level, but at the millions level, to employ people, and that they're sustainable industries, and that they are also living wage jobs, and so forth and so on, right? So I think that's what we need to do, is demonstrate that it is possible.
Marcia, you want the last word?
Oh my. Well, you've all been so articulate and have really laid out. I think the combination of what we need to be doing, getting out in the streets, direct action, making demands, and building up the solutions on the ground. I would just add that, in terms of, I think, building the solutions of participatory governance and really changing the way we organize ourselves, the ideas coming out of bioregional governance that I spoke about earlier, I think offer a very rich sort of framework for us to explore, beginning with how we relate to each other, because ultimately we have to change how we interact with each other, how we relate to each other in the community and to the earth and to our human and non-human relatives. And so there's so much that we can learn from, as I said before, indigenous communities, and from the organizing of Black communities, the organizing of farm workers, and other food system workers, and from global cases. So in terms of scaling up, both at the local level, like that example from Marica, Brazil, with a basic income, they did that by establishing a local currency, a municipal currency, just for Marica, so that they could keep the resources within their own community and keep reinvesting and building out. So, what might that look like if we start having, here, these like conversations, building relationships, with our neighbors, and then at the bioregional level, can we start to think about, can we have a basic income just within our own, within our own cities or within our own bioregions? And partly as we expand out these kinds of locally grounded, community-centered and led initiatives, and we start connecting those and building that network across the country, then we're not only where we can show to the elected officials, like, this is a way forward, but at the same time, we aren't waiting for them. We are building the networks, and the I think of the mycelia underground, but we are doing this above ground as well. That will really keep us moving forward. We don't have to wait. We can start doing this right now. There's so much power in what we can do just at that level and building out across the country. So I'm hopeful. Challenges for sure, but I'm hopeful that we can do things differently, and grow.
May we do things differently in 2021 and post-pandemic. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. Thank you to EcoFarm for hosting and really forcing us to think about reimagining the future and the food system in the United States and abroad. Thank you all so much for this really important conversation.